We're at the final chapter of the textbook. So some interesting topics here. Deals a lot with planning for e-commerce. And a lot of this chapter is oriented more around large corporations. And I suspect that most of you are involved or hoping to be involved in small startups, maybe starting up your own. And so we'll look at just a few of the items that might be of interest to you. As always, and this really applies to anything in the business, you need to identify what the possible benefits are. And those benefits should have some way of being measured. You have to be able to quantify and see, are you getting the benefits that you set out to get when you embarked with your e-commerce activities? So, for example, you wanted to increase sales, or by going to e-commerce or implementing a new e-commerce provider, you wanted to reduce your costs. Whatever it is, it should be quantifiable. Increase customer satisfaction. While that is a good goal and certainly very important in order to have an effective e-commerce strategy for your business, it's a challenge to measure that. You can use survey tools and look at customer returns, postings on social media, but it's not quite as easy to measure as sales or costs, which are pretty straightforward. So even if they are intangible, as I mentioned a minute ago, one possible measurement is the number of return customers you have. Was this purchase a first-time customer? Or looking at your database, do you see that they've purchased 2 or 3 times in the past? Using websites to build brands or to enhance your marketing is great. And again, if you're going to, if that's your strategy and approach, you do need to have some opinion polls or some way to measure how effective. What's the number of likes that you're getting on Facebook after you run an e-commerce campaign? Complicated to measure brand awareness, as I mentioned. That's some of these things are more challenging. The book gives a good example of Philips Lighting and how they use their website to improve customer service. One of the issues, if you're in a larger organization, you have a supply chain team that is looking to leverage e-commerce to reduce the overall cost and to reduce the cycle time, the lead time required on items. And so in that case, they're not actually using e-commerce to sell products, they're using e-commerce to purchase components necessary for your organization. And one of the ways they do that is through auction sites where they can put a RFQ out there, or request for quote, or a number of different tools. The challenge we have, and this goes across any technology in business, not just related to e-commerce, it's not always that easy to estimate the total project costs. You can know what you're going to spend in software, but how much time is it going to take? How much disruption is it going to cost? And to further complicate that is hardware and software technologies are changing daily. Hardware may be going down, but as our software programs are doing more sophisticated things, we may need to have more hardware, even though it's less expensive. We may need to have more of it, and the total cost may increase, even though the individual components have gone down. TCO, total cost of ownership. This is a good concept regardless of whether you're a small startup company or a larger company, to where you look at everything that is involved in a particular course of action. So it's not just the hardware and software, and certainly you may have some contractors. Those are kind of easy to quantify, but employee costs. Well, you say you're already paying that employee anyway, but the difference is you're tying them up working on this project when they could be doing something else instead. And so you really have to think broader about what is the total cost of that, and even the cost, the cost of capital investment. That money could be used for something else. So there's a time value of money that you also have to take into consideration when you're making an investment, because typically you invest the money up front and you don't get the benefits until after the program is fully implemented. And that's another aspect of that, the opportunity cost. And this is an interesting idea that you could have achieved benefits, whether that's customer satisfaction or improved dollars to the corporate, to the bottom line, if you had pursued a more aggressive e-commerce initiative. How many customers did you lose because you hadn't upgraded your e-commerce website? What costs remain high that you could have reduced if you had done some improvements in how your inventory is managed through your e-commerce site? So those are opportunity costs that people oftentimes forget to take into consideration. So website costs, talk a little bit about that. I like the author there says, yeah, there's some hardware associated, there's some software associated with it, but really the majority of the cost of your website is in labor. You can get a website, e-commerce website set up at one of the providers for very inexpensively. I mentioned in an earlier lecture, GoDaddy, Yahoo Small Business. There's a number of them out there that have very inexpensive website costs. But then you have to take into consideration the amount of your labor, and your employees' labor to maintain that. That's not insignificant. So I think, small online store, the author says less than $1,000. I think you can do it less than that today, actually. Let's see. And you can't ignore the fact that there's ongoing costs for the site. So even though there's an initial cost that you can estimate and quantify that, there's quite a bit of reoccurring cost associated with that you wouldn't necessarily think there would be. You go, well, I already bought the hardware. Well, there's maintenance on that hardware. Stuff doesn't last forever. It breaks down. Well, we already spent the money on the software. Yeah, but they keep coming out with software updates, and because of security issues, you need to keep it updated and to the latest version. And of course, all your customers expect your website to be fresh and new. And so you've got labor associated with keeping the website constantly updated with current content. So the author includes a chart just kind of demonstrating some of the initial costs that you might expect to encounter, depending on if you're a small store or a large company, and how much you should budget for in ongoing expenses and costs. And I thought this was a good chart that the author included about important web hosting service features. Some of those things, like backup and recovery, really big. And that's why I do not recommend, as I said earlier in another lecture, I do not recommend that you host your own site. Go with one of the providers because they have a backup and recovery plan. They've also got 24/7, 365 technical support, and it's really expensive in the early days when you're a small company to try and do that yourself. So just as kind of a reminder, again, when you're looking at cost benefits, you start by identifying what each of those are. And again, you have to find ways to quantify it. Then you determine what is the value of that. If you're able to increase customer satisfaction 10%, so what? Does that translate into 5% increase in sales? You need to have you have to quantify what the benefit would be on that, and really you got to tie everything to a dollar. You got to somehow figure out what that translates to in a dollar. And so once you look at that, the costs associated with a particular activity and the benefits, then you'll be able to see, does it make sense to do this? Sometimes you will look at something and say, wow, this would be really cool if we could do this. But you look at it and you say, boy, the costs are far greater than the financial benefits we would get from that. Is that something we really want to do? Sometimes you do because there's the intangible thing about brand awareness and perceived leadership of a company within an industry. You may say that even though it doesn't directly impact sales, it has an impact long term. One way or the other, though, you need to look at that. Does it make sense financially to go ahead and do it? If not, and we're going to do it anyway, we need to have a very good reason why we're investing in that. So you hear, go back to your BA 101, ROI. It's been used as a way for managers and investors to evaluate if something is a good thing to do. And sometimes companies will choose not to do it. I think they don't need to do it because they're saying we need to be doing this technology upgrade. We need to be improving our e-commerce website because if we don't, the competition is going to leapfrog ahead of us. And in some cases, that's the right thing to do. Like the example the author gives, newspaper websites don't necessarily make money, but they want to have an online presence. They're trying to remake themselves from the old print into something that lives on in a digital world. So maybe they don't have to make money from day one with their website. At some point, of course, there is no free lunch. Some point you have to make money somehow. And of course, with websites, that's usually there's two ways to do it. A subscription service where people pay to be able to read your content, or secondly, you put a bunch of annoying ads on your website. The downside to ROI is this last bullet. It tends to emphasize, put more value, more credence to short-term benefits over long-term benefits. And that's unfortunate. Sometimes we're just not thinking far enough into the future in our decision-making process. So this is an interesting chart I thought that the publisher included, just kind of describing what the web looked like. Starting back in the 90s, the static brochure, it was like a product data sheet, except that you could access it electronically, on your computer at any time, day or night. To where then we started actually adding in transactions where you could not only read about product, but you could actually say, "Hey, I want it. Let's make a deal. Let's conclude this transaction." And then we got into more of the era right from the end of the last century up until about 10 years ago. And I'd really say that's when Amazon really started to dominate the internet and e-commerce. And they very quickly realized on the customer relationship and what they could do in terms of tracking your ordering patterns and making suggestions. And they very quickly realized that people want to know the status of their shipments. And so developing systems that allowed them to immediately acknowledge your order, to let you know via text message when your order shipped, and all the levels of communication that they developed. And what also came in with that, and I think social media drove a lot of this too, is that far from being a static website, all websites now, not just social media websites, and not just news websites, but e-commerce websites, people are coming to expect to be new and fresh, updated on a regular basis. This is not, like the old Sears catalog that was published once a year. This is more published once a day kind. And then, of course, now we've got customization built into our websites, recognizing that people are visiting our websites not from necessarily a desktop computer. It could be a laptop computer or a tablet that has smaller screens, and really a growing large number of e-commerce transactions now are taking place on a smartphone with a very small screen. And so having our sites optimized for each of those viewing screen sizes, that's become the norm now, what we need to do to be effective. Okay, so here's the password for the quiz for Chapter 12, Opportunity. And so write that password down, Opportunity, to unlock the Chapter 12 quiz. Okay, just a few remaining thoughts on this chapter. Some companies will outsource their entire online business, and that can make a lot of sense. Like I say, especially if you're a small startup, you need to focus on other things. And so it may make really good sense for you to outsource it and build your business. But a lot of companies understand that the danger in outsourcing is if the company doesn't do it right. You're really trusting the company you outsource to do the best possible thing for your organization. And so there's a risk there. So I think the ideal situation is a balance between your inside team and your outsourced team to work together on the project, figure out what tasks each one can do best, and what tasks your organization has the bandwidth to be able to handle. And so don't totally disengage from the project if possible. Have some involvement in it. It's your future. You should be involved in some degree. And so that's kind of called, your term you'll hear, partial outsourcing or component outsourcing, where you've identified the portions that you can hand off completely and you keep some internally for yourself. Project management. Now, I thought this is interesting. That really The official project management formal techniques, that whole concept originally came out of the military. But it's really just the idea of saying we're going to have a detailed plan on how we get from point A to point B. We're going to monitor and track it because nothing ever goes exactly as planned, and you may need to make some mid-course corrections throughout the way. I did a major project where I transferred an entire manufacturing cell from Portland to Japan. And we had some hiccups along the way, like the fact that we didn't realize that half of Japan has 120 volt, 60 hertz, just like the United States. And the other half of Japan, the power grid is 220 volt, 50 hertz, just like Europe. And of course, where our new manufacturing cell was going to be located happened to be in the Europe style 220 volt 50 hertz, and none of our test equipment, the equipment we used on the production floor, would work on 220 volts. And so at the last minute we had to scramble and identify alternate pieces of equipment to utilize on that. We were able to, because we were managing the project and tracking everything, to realize when we hit that bump in the road and adjust some other aspects in the project. So even though that caused us some delays, overall the project was not delayed. We got it up and going right on time. And some of the software you see that is used there, Microsoft Project is the predominant one, because it comes as part of Microsoft Office, and so a lot of organizations use it. It's a pretty good tool. I've used it a lot. Like anything, it's not perfect, but it really helps you keep a handle on a major project. Smaller projects, probably not as useful. Now, one of the key things, and I like that the author brought it up, is that after you implement your e-commerce activities, your website updates, you really should have a review. Everything is up and running, and so then you get together and examine. We had a plan, we thought it was going to go. What actually happened? Now, the key to remember here, this is not to be used to assign blame. What you're doing is you're gathering lessons learned. There will be some things in the project that went well, so learn from that and say, hey, that worked really well. Next time we need to make sure that we do that. But also recognize what didn't work. And, it's a learning thing, so you can say, boy, the next time we do a similar project to this, I'll make sure that we don't do that, because that did not work at all. And so what you're doing is you're creating best practices, and you should be documenting, logging that someplace for the next project. It'd be helpful at the next project you have, like that is similar, or any project. And the first thing you do when you get your project team together is to pull out the book of best practices, and you review the do's and the don'ts, and so that everyone's on the same page. Say, remember, we want to avoid XYZ. And this is a good question to ask too. When you look at, well, how well was the project managed? How well did we do that? Did we have the right organizational structure in place to be able to do that? And did each part of the project, each project team, did they perform like we expected? So it's a little bit more of a high level looking at it, saying, do we have our organizational structure in place to allow us to succeed? And did each of the teams, are there some teams that maybe need some development? And say, I think if we invested in some training with our customer service team, that we could get a better performance, from them next time. So again, it's a tool not to blame anyone, not that anyone gets in trouble, gets dinged on their annual performance review. It's a tool to help you do better next time. Okay, and with that, that's the end of chapter 12 and the end of the textbook. And aren't you happy that you don't have to listen to my voice anymore? So seriously, hope that it's been helpful. And that concludes the lectures for this course.